There is something more unsettling than chaos, more disturbing than judgment, more difficult to endure than destruction, and that is silence. Not the kind of silence that brings peace, not the kind that allows rest, but the kind that follows after a voice has spoken for the last time, the kind that leaves questions unanswered, prayers hanging in the air, hearts searching for something they can no longer hear. And this is where the story begins, not in the noise of battle, not in the fire of confrontation, but in the quiet aftermath of restoration, in a time when everything should have been right, when everything should have reflected renewal, because Israel had already passed through judgment. They had experienced exile, they had lost their land, their temple, their identity as a nation, and then, against all expectation, they had returned, brought back from captivity, given another chance to rebuild, to restore, to begin again. And for a moment it seemed as though everything had changed. The temple was rebuilt, the walls of Jerusalem restored, worship re-established, the visible signs of revival present in a way that suggested the past had been corrected, that the lessons had been learned, that the people would not repeat what had led them into exile in the first place. And yet beneath that surface, something else was forming, something quieter, something less obvious, but no less dangerous, because while the structures had been rebuilt, the hearts of the people had not fully returned, while the rituals had resumed. The devotion behind them had begun to fade, and this is the kind of drift that is hardest to detect, because it does not announce itself. It does not break everything at once. It moves slowly, subtly, allowing the appearance of faithfulness to remain while the reality begins to shift. And this is the environment into which Malachi steps, not as the first voice, not as the only prophet, but as the final one, the last to speak before something changes in a way no one could fully understand at the time, because his words would not just address the present, they would mark the end of an era, the closing of a chapter that had been defined by God speaking directly through prophets, calling his people back, correcting, warning, guiding, and now, that voice was about to fall silent. But before it did, one final message would be delivered, one final confrontation would take place, and it would not come in the form of fire from heaven. It would not come through dramatic miracles. It would come through words, through questions, through a dialogue that exposes what has been hidden beneath the surface. And the first words set the tone in a way that feels almost unexpected, because they do not begin with accusation, they begin with a declaration, simple, direct, and yet immediately challenged. I have loved you, says the Lord. And that statement, instead of being received with gratitude, instead of being accepted as truth, is met with doubt, with resistance, with a question that reveals the condition of the people more than any accusation could. How have you loved us? And in that response, everything is exposed. Not outward rebellion, not open defiance, but something deeper, something more subtle, a loss of trust, a disconnect between what has been declared and what is believed. Because the people are not denying God entirely. They are questioning his goodness. They are measuring his love against their circumstances, against what they see, against what they feel, and finding it lacking. And this is where the real issue begins to surface. Because when people begin to question the foundation, everything built on that foundation begins to weaken. And God responds, not with dismissal, but with reminder, pointing back to history, to what has already been done, to the ways in which his choice, his protection, his faithfulness had already been demonstrated. And yet even that reminder does not immediately resolve the tension, because the problem is not lack of evidence, it is perception, it is the lens through which they are viewing their reality. And that lens has been shaped by disappointment, by unmet expectations, by the slow drift that has taken place over time. And this is what makes the moment so significant, because it reveals that the people are not far from God in distance. They are far from him in understanding, in trust, in alignment, and that kind of distance is not always visible. It does not always show in outward behavior at first, but it inevitably begins to affect everything. And as the dialogue continues, the focus shifts from the people as a whole to those who were meant to lead them. The priests, the ones responsible for maintaining the integrity of worship, the ones who should have been the closest to the truth, the ones who should have guarded the standard. And yet even here, the same pattern appears. Not open rejection, but quiet compromise, a lowering of what was once upheld, a shift from reverence to routine, from honor to obligation. And the way this is exposed is not through direct accusation alone, but through comparison, through the question of how a son honors his father, how a servant respects his master, and if that kind of honor exists in human relationships, then where is the honor that should be given to God? And the answer is not spoken directly, but it is revealed through what they have been doing, through the offerings they bring, through the sacrifices that no longer reflect value, no longer reflect care, no longer reflect the recognition of who God is, because instead of bringing what is worthy, they bring what is convenient, what is left over, what is flawed, offering it as though it is sufficient, as though it is acceptable, and in doing so, they reveal that their understanding of God has diminished, that he is no longer seen as worthy of their best, but merely as someone to be appeased, someone to be satisfied with minimal effort. And this is where the confrontation becomes sharper, because what they are doing outwardly still resembles worship. It still follows the form, the structure, the appearance of devotion, but the substance has changed, the meaning has been lost, and this is one of the most dangerous places a person or a people can reach, where the external actions remain while the internal reality has shifted, because it creates the illusion that everything is fine, that everything is functioning as it should, when in fact, the very core has been compromised. And Malachi's role in this moment is not to introduce something new, but to reveal what already exists, to bring into the open what has been hidden beneath routine, beneath familiarity, beneath the assumption that because the system is still in place, the relationship is still intact. And as he speaks, as he confronts, as he exposes, the tension builds, not because the message is unclear, but because it is undeniable, because it forces a recognition that cannot be avoided, that something has gone wrong, not externally, but internally, not in structure, but in heart. And this is where the story begins, not with dramatic collapse, but with quiet corruption, not with visible destruction, but with invisible drift. And it is this kind of beginning that leads to something even more significant, because when the problem is internal, the solution must be as well, and whether the people will respond to that, whether they will recognize it, whether they will return, is the question that will shape everything that follows. Because this is not just the last message, it is the last opportunity before the silence begins. The accusation did not come first, the exposure did. Because what God began to reveal was not just what the people were doing, but how far their understanding had fallen, and nowhere was that more visible than in the place that was supposed to be the center of their devotion, the place where heaven and earth were meant to meet, the temple, and within it, the priests, those who stood between the people and God, those entrusted with the responsibility of preserving what was sacred. And yet the reality unfolding there was not one of reverence, but of erosion, not a collapse that could be easily seen from the outside, but a slow and steady decline that had transformed something holy into something ordinary, something routine, something that no longer carried weight. And the way this was revealed was not through abstract language, but through something tangible, something undeniable, the offerings themselves, because what the priests were bringing before God was not their best, it was what they could afford to lose, animals that were blind, crippled, diseased, sacrifices that would have been rejected in any other context, offerings that they would never dare present to a human ruler, and yet they brought them to God as though it were acceptable, as though it were enough, and in doing so, they exposed something deeper than negligence. They revealed a shift in perception, because you only give less when you believe less. You only lower your offering when you lower the value of the one you are offering it to. And this is what had happened, not in a moment, not through a single decision, but over time through repeated actions that slowly redefined what was normal, what was acceptable, what was expected, until the extraordinary had become ordinary, until the sacred had become routine, and the priests, instead of correcting this, instead of guarding against it, had become participants in it, allowing it to continue, allowing it to spread, allowing it to define the worship of an entire people. And the confrontation that follows is sharp, not because it is angry, but because it is precise, because it cuts directly to the issue, asking a question that cannot be easily dismissed. Try offering that to your governor. Try presenting that kind of gift to someone who holds authority over you. Would they accept it? Would they be pleased? Would they receive it with honor? And the answer is obvious, no. They would not, and yet this is what was being brought before God, which means the issue is not ignorance, it is choice. It is the decision to give less because less is believed to be sufficient. And this is where the weight of the message begins to intensify, because it moves beyond the action into the meaning behind the action, beyond what is done into why it is done. And the conclusion is unavoidable, that the priests have despised the name of God, not necessarily through words, not through open rejection, but through their actions, through the way they treat what is meant to be holy, through the way they handle what is meant to be honored. And even in this, their response reveals the depth of their disconnect, because instead of recognizing the truth, instead of acknowledging the reality, they question it, asking how they have despised his name, as though the evidence were not already clear, as though the very offerings they present did not speak for themselves. And this kind of blindness is not accidental. It is the result of prolonged compromise, because when something is done long enough, it begins to feel normal, it begins to feel justified, it begins to lose its sense of wrongness. And this is what had happened, not just to individuals, but to an entire system of worship. And the consequence of this is not simply that the offerings are rejected, it is that the relationship itself is affected. Because worship is not about ritual alone, it is about recognition, it is about alignment. It is about acknowledging who God is and responding accordingly. And when that recognition is lost, the ritual becomes empty. The action becomes meaningless. The form remains, but the substance disappears. And this is why the response from God is not limited to correction. It includes rejection. A statement that it would be better if the temple doors were shut entirely, better that the system ceased to function than continue in a way that misrepresents what it is meant to be. And that statement carries a weight that is difficult to fully grasp, because it suggests that false worship is not neutral, it is not harmless, it is not simply less effective. It is offensive, it distorts what is true, it presents something that appears right but is fundamentally wrong, and that distortion has consequences, not just for those who participate in it, but for the understanding of everyone who observes it. And yet even within this confrontation, there is a contrast introduced. Something that shifts the perspective beyond Israel alone, because while they have diminished the name of God, while they have treated it as common, there are others, beyond their borders, beyond their identity, who recognize its greatness, who honor it in ways that Israel has failed to do. And this comparison is not meant to elevate others above them, but to highlight the gap between what they are meant to be and what they have become, because they were chosen to represent something unique, something distinct, something that would reflect the reality of who God is to the world. And instead, they have become indistinguishable, their worship no longer carrying the weight it once did, their actions no longer aligning with their calling. And this is where the message begins to move from exposure to warning, because what is at stake is not just the integrity of their rituals, it is the integrity of their identity. And the priests, as leaders, bear a greater responsibility in this, because their role was not simply to perform, it was to teach, to guide, to uphold the standard, to ensure that what was done reflected what was true. And in failing to do so, they have not only compromised themselves, they have led others into the same compromise. And the warning that follows is not abstract, it is direct, that if they do not listen, if they do not take it to heart, if they do not restore honor to the name of God, then the consequences will extend beyond the present, affecting their future, their legacy, their standing. And this is where the message becomes deeply personal, because it is no longer about general behavior, it is about individual responsibility, about the role each person plays in maintaining or distorting what is true. And the priests, who once held a position of honor, now stand at a crossroads, faced with the reality of what they have allowed, what they have become, and what they must now decide, whether to continue in the path they have been on, or to return, to realign, to restore what has been lost. And this moment, though it may not appear dramatic on the surface, carries a tension that is just as significant as any visible conflict, because it is a battle not of swords, but of perception, not of territory, but of truth. And the outcome of that battle will determine not only the direction of the priests, but the direction of the entire people, because when leadership is compromised, the effect spreads. It influences, it shapes, it defines what is normal for everyone else. And as the words of Malachi continue to unfold, As the confrontation deepens, as the reality becomes clearer, the question that begins to rise is not whether the problem exists, but whether there will be a response, whether the exposure will lead to change, whether the warning will be heard, because this is not just another message. It is the final one before something changes in a way that no one yet fully understands, and the weight of that reality is beginning to build. Because once the voice stops, once the silence begins, the opportunity to respond to that voice will no longer be the same, and what is done now, in this moment, carries a significance that extends far beyond the present, shaping what comes next in ways that cannot yet be fully seen. The confrontation does not stop at the temple. It moves deeper, into something even more personal, more destructive, because what begins in worship never stays contained there. It spreads into every part of life, shaping relationships, decisions, and identity. And this is where the message of Malachi shifts, from the corruption of priests to the condition of the people themselves, revealing that what has been lost is not only reverence for God, but faithfulness to one another. And nowhere is that more clearly seen than in their marriages. Because marriage was never meant to be just a social agreement. It was a covenant, a reflection of something sacred, something binding, something that carried weight beyond emotional convenience, and yet even this had been reduced, reshaped, treated as something temporary, something disposable, something that could be abandoned when it no longer served personal desire. And the evidence of that shift is undeniable, because the people had begun to break their vows, to walk away from the partners they had committed to pursue relationships that were easier, more beneficial, more aligned with their current desires, and in doing so, they were not just breaking promises, they were violating something deeper, something that was meant to reflect faithfulness itself. And this is why the confrontation is so direct, because it exposes not only the action, but the meaning behind the action, that when faithfulness is abandoned in one place, it is often already gone in another, that unfaithfulness in relationships reflects a deeper unfaithfulness toward God, and the language used to describe this is not casual, it is not softened, it is described as betrayal, as treachery, as something that cuts against the very identity of who they were meant to be. And this is what makes the moment so heavy, because it reveals that the issue is not isolated, it is systemic. It touches every part of life, from the temple to the home, from public worship to private commitment, and the result of that is not only broken relationships, but a breakdown of trust, of stability, of identity itself. Because when covenant is no longer honored, nothing remains secure, nothing remains constant. Everything becomes subject to change based on feeling, based on desire, based on circumstance, and that kind of instability does not remain contained. It spreads, it influences, it shapes how people see everything, including God Himself. And this is where the message takes another turn, because the people begin to express something that reveals just how far the shift has gone. They begin to question justice, not in a humble way, not in a seeking way, but in a way that reflects frustration, even accusation, saying that those who do evil are actually prospering, that those who do wrong seem to be favored, and in that statement, something deeper is exposed, because it shows that their understanding of God has been shaped by what they see in the moment rather than by what they know to be true. And this is one of the most dangerous transitions that can take place. When perception overrides truth, when immediate experience becomes the lens through which everything is interpreted, because it leads to conclusions that are not rooted in reality, but in incomplete observation. And this is exactly what is happening. Because instead of recognizing their own condition, instead of acknowledging their own compromise, they begin to shift the focus outward, questioning why others seem to succeed while they struggle, questioning whether God truly sees, whether He truly judges, whether He truly cares. And this questioning, though it may appear honest on the surface, is rooted in something else, something deeper, a loss of trust, a loss of confidence in the character of God. And that loss does not happen suddenly. It develops over time, through repeated moments of disappointment, through unmet expectations, through the slow drift that has already been taking place, and now it surfaces in a way that cannot be ignored, because it challenges not just what they believe, but who they believe God is. And the response to this is not immediate judgment. It is clarification. It is a redirection, because the issue is not that God is absent, It is that his timing is misunderstood, his justice not yet seen in its fullness, his actions not yet completed in the way they expect. And this is where the tension begins to build towards something greater, because the question of justice cannot remain unanswered. It demands resolution, it demands clarity, it demands a moment where everything is set right. And that moment is introduced not as a possibility, but as a certainty, something that is coming, something that will not be delayed forever, something that will reveal the difference between what is true and what only appears to be. And yet even this promise carries weight, because it is not only a hope, it is also a warning, because when justice comes, it does not only address others, it addresses everyone, it reveals everything, it brings into the light what has been hidden, what has been justified, what has been ignored. And this is where the message begins to move beyond the present into the future, beyond what is happening now into what is coming next. And that shift changes everything, because it means that the current state is not permanent, it is not final, it is not the end of the story. It is a moment within a larger narrative, a moment that will be addressed, corrected, revealed for what it truly is. And this realization is meant to do something specific. It is meant to interrupt the current trajectory, to challenge the assumptions that have taken root, to call the people back to a different understanding, a different perspective, one that is not based on what they see immediately, but on what they know to be true about God's character, His faithfulness, His justice, His consistency. And yet the question remains whether they will receive that, whether they will adjust their perception, whether they will return to alignment. Because the pattern that has been revealed so far suggests resistance, suggests a tendency to question rather than to repent. And this is what makes the moment so critical, because it stands at the intersection between what is and what could be, between the continuation of the current path and the possibility of change. And the presence of that possibility is what gives the message its urgency, because it means that the story is not yet fixed, not yet determined, that there is still an opportunity to respond, to shift, to return, and yet that opportunity will not remain indefinitely, because the voice that is speaking now is approaching its final moment, the last call before the silence begins. And what is done with that voice, what is done with that message, will determine not only the immediate outcome, but the experience of what follows. Because when the voice is no longer there, when the silence takes its place, the memory of what was said becomes even more significant, even more weighty, even more final. The questions had been asked, the condition had been exposed, but now the message begins to move into something more intense, something that shifts from diagnosis to declaration, because it is one thing to reveal what is wrong, it is another to reveal what is coming. And this is where the voice of Malachi begins to carry a different weight, a tone that is no longer only confronting the present, but announcing the future, because the doubts of the people, their questions about justice, their frustration at what they perceive to be unfair, all lead to a single point, a demand for God to act, to show Himself, to prove that He sees, that He judges, that He has not abandoned what is right. And the response they receive is not what they expect, because instead of immediate intervention, instead of visible correction, they are told that something is coming, something that will answer their question in a way far greater than they anticipate, but also far more dangerous than they understand. The promise of a messenger enters the story not as comfort alone, but as preparation, because before anything changes, before justice is revealed, before the presence of God is experienced in a new way, there will be a voice, a forerunner, someone who comes to prepare the way, to clear the path, to call people back, to confront what has been allowed to remain. And this idea carries both hope and tension, because a messenger does not come when everything is fine. A messenger comes when something must be corrected, when something must be made ready, when something significant is about to happen. And the people, though they long for God to act, do not yet understand what that action will require, because preparation is not passive. It demands response, it demands change, it demands that what has been exposed is no longer ignored. And this is where the message begins to press deeper, because the coming of God is not described as gentle, not described as easy, but as something refining, something that tests, something that separates what is real from what is false, what is pure from what is corrupted. The imagery shifts, becoming sharper, more intense, because the presence of God is compared to fire, not destructive fire alone, but refining fire. The kind that burns away impurity, the kind that exposes what cannot remain. And this is where the tension reaches a new level, because the people had been asking for justice, asking for God to act, but now they are confronted with a question they had not considered. Who can endure that moment? Who can stand when that presence arrives? Who can remain when everything hidden is revealed? And this question changes everything, because it turns the focus inward. It forces recognition that the issue is not only external, not only about others, but about themselves, about their own condition, their own actions, their own alignment. And suddenly the desire for justice becomes more complex. Because justice does not discriminate based on expectation, it reveals truth wherever it exists. And that means that those who call for it must also be prepared to face it. The focus returns to the priests, to the place where corruption first became visible. Because if restoration is to happen, it must begin there. It must address the source, the point where influence spreads outward, and the promise given is not only one of judgment, but of purification, that the priests themselves will be refined, restored, brought back to a place where their offerings once again reflect righteousness, where worship is no longer empty, no longer routine, but aligned with truth. And this is significant, because it shows that the intention is not destruction alone. It is correction. It is restoration. It is the possibility that what has been lost can be made right again. But that possibility is not automatic. It requires the process. It requires the fire. It requires the removal of what cannot remain. And that process is not comfortable. It is not easy. It is necessary. And then the message expands, moving beyond the priests to the entire people. Because what has been described is not limited to one group. It touches everyone. And the list that follows is not abstract. It is specific. It names actions, behaviors, patterns that have been allowed to continue. Sorcery, adultery, false oaths, oppression of workers, injustice toward the vulnerable, the neglect of those who have no protection. And in naming these things, the message makes something clear, that the problem is not only spiritual in the sense of worship, it is practical, it is visible, it is present in how people treat one another, how they use power, how they respond to responsibility. And this is where the idea of justice becomes fully formed, not as a distant concept, but as something that addresses real actions, real consequences, real lives. And the declaration that follows is direct, that God will draw near for judgment, not distant, not removed, but present, engaged, active. And this presence is both the answer to their question and the challenge to their assumption, because they had wondered where justice was, and now they are told it is coming. But when it comes, it will not align with their limited perspective. It will reveal everything according to truth, not according to perception. And yet, within this intensity, within this rising tension, there is a statement that shifts everything again. A reminder that stands as both reassurance and warning, that God does not change, that His nature remains constant, that His faithfulness has not been altered by their behavior, and this is why they have not been consumed. This is why they still exist. This is why there is still an opportunity to respond, because if justice had been immediate and absolute, there would be nothing left, but instead, there is space, there is time, there is a moment in which they can still turn, still respond, still align with what is true. And this reveals something critical, that the delay they interpret as absence is actually mercy, that the time they question is actually opportunity, that the silence they fear has not yet come because the voice is still speaking, still calling, still offering a way back. But that window is not infinite, and this is what gives the moment its urgency, because everything that has been said is leading toward a decision, toward a response that cannot be postponed indefinitely, because the messenger will come, the refinement will happen, the justice will be revealed, and the only question that remains is where they will stand when that moment arrives, whether they will be aligned with what is true or exposed by what is false, whether they will be refined or consumed, whether they will recognize the voice now or search for it later when it is no longer there. And as the message continues to unfold, the weight to that reality begins to settle, because this is not just another warning. It is the final one before everything changes, before the voice that has guided, corrected, and called them for generations fall silent, leaving behind only what has already been said, and what they do with that will determine everything that follows. If everything that has been said so far reveals the problem, then what comes next reveals the solution. But it is not a complicated solution. It is not hidden. It is not beyond their reach. In fact, it is painfully simple, and that is what makes it so difficult. Because simplicity removes excuses, it removes complexity, it removes the ability to misunderstand, and the command is clear, direct, unavoidable. Return to me, and I will return to you. And that statement carries both promise and responsibility, because it places the next move not on God, but on the people. It reveals that the distance they feel is not created by his absence, but by their movement away from him. And that means restoration is possible, but it requires a response. It requires a decision. It requires action. And yet even here, even in the face of everything that has already been exposed, everything that has already been revealed, the response is not immediate obedience. It is another question, another deflection, another attempt to avoid the weight of what is being asked. How shall we return? And this question, though it may sound sincere, reveals something deeper, because it suggests that they do not see the problem, or perhaps they do not want to see it, because to see it would require change, would require acknowledgement, would require the breaking of patterns that have become comfortable. And so the answer comes in a way that removes all ambiguity, that brings the issue into focus with clarity that cannot be avoided. Will a man rob God? And the shock of that question is immediate, because it reframes their actions in a way they had not considered. It takes what they had normalized and reveals it as something far more serious, something that carries moral weight, something that cannot be dismissed as minor or insignificant. And once again, their response reflects their blindness. How have we robbed you? And the answer is direct, in tithes and offerings, in what they have withheld, in what they have chosen not to give, in what they have kept for themselves while presenting the appearance of participation. And this is where the message cuts deeper, because it is not only about money, it is not only about resources, it is about trust, it is about priority, it is about what they believe God is worth, because what you give reflects what you value, and what you withhold reveals what you truly trust. And in this case, their actions show that they trust themselves more than they trust God, that they prioritize their own security over obedience, that they have reduced giving from an act of worship to a calculation of loss. And this is why the consequence is described not as random hardship, but as a direct result of their choices, that they are under a curse. Not because God is arbitrary, but because their actions have aligned them with a system that cannot sustain blessing, a system where self-preservation replaces faith, where control replaces trust, where giving is seen as loss rather than alignment. And yet even in this, the message does not stop at exposure. It moves into invitation, something rare, something unexpected, because instead of simply demanding change, God challenges them, invites them to test him, to step into obedience and see what happens, to move beyond their fear, beyond their calculation, beyond their assumption that giving will leave them with less, and instead discover that obedience opens the door to something greater. And the imagery used is overwhelming. The windows of heaven opened, blessing poured out beyond capacity, protection restored, provision secured. And this is not presented as manipulation, not as a transaction, but as a restoration of relationship, because when trust is restored, everything else begins to realign. When priority is corrected, the system begins to function as it was intended. And this is where the tension becomes deeply personal, because the issue is no longer abstract, it is no longer distant. It is immediate, it is practical, it is something that requires a decision in the present. And yet the message does not assume compliance. It does not assume that the people will respond, because the pattern so far suggests resistance, suggests a tendency to question rather than to act, to justify rather than to change. And this is where another layer is revealed, something that exists beneath the surface, something that divides the people not externally but internally, because not everyone responds the same way. Not everyone dismisses the message, not everyone remains indifferent. There are some who hear, some who recognize, some who fear the Lord, and their response is different, not loud, not dramatic, but real. They speak with one another, they reflect, that they consider. They align themselves with what has been said, and this distinction is critical, because it shows that even in a time of widespread drift, there are still those who remain faithful, still those who respond, still those who choose differently. And this introduces a separation that is not yet visible externally, but is already forming internally. A distinction between those who hear and those who ignore, between those who return and those who remain, and the significance of that distinction will become clear as the message continues. Because what is coming next will not treat everyone the same, it will reveal the difference that has already been established, and as this part of the story unfolds, the urgency increases. Because the invitation has been given, the path has been made clear, the opportunity is present, and yet the time to respond is not unlimited, because the voice that is speaking now is moving toward its final moment, the last call before silence. And what is done with that call will determine not only the present condition, but the experience of everything that follows, because when the voice is no longer there, when the silence begins, the opportunity to hear it in this way will not return. And the question that now stands before the people is simple, but heavy. Will they return, or will they continue? Will they respond, or will they remain unchanged? Will they trust, or will they hold on to what they believe is theirs? Because that decision, though it may seem small in the moment, carries consequences that extend far beyond what they can currently see, shaping not only their present, but their future, and ultimately determining whether the silence that is coming will be a place of waiting or a place of loss. The invitation had been given, the line had been drawn, but now the message moves into something deeper, something that reveals not just what people do, but how they are ultimately seen. Because when truth is spoken, it does more than confront behavior. It separates hearts. It exposes what is real and what is only appearance. And this is where the voice of Malachi shifts again, not away from the people, but deeper into them, into the unseen distinction that has been forming all along. Because while many questioned, resisted, and justified, there were others who responded differently, others who did not dismiss the message, who did not turn it aside, but who allowed it to settle, to shape their thinking, to change their direction. And this difference, though quiet, though almost invisible on the surface, is now brought into focus in a way that defines everything that follows. The people had said many things, words filled with doubt, with frustration, with accusation, claiming that serving God was pointless, that obedience brought no benefit, that those who acted arrogantly seemed to prosper while those who remained faithful saw no visible reward. And these words were not spoken once, they were repeated, shared, reinforced among one another, forming a kind of collective mindset that shaped how they viewed everything. And this is important, because what people say reveals what they believe, and what they believe determines how they act. And over time, this pattern had created a culture where faithfulness felt unnecessary, where devotion seemed unrewarded, where trust appeared irrational. And yet within that environment, there were those who chose differently. Those who feared the Lord, those who did not allow the dominant voice to define their perspective. Those who held on to something deeper than what they could immediately see. And their response was not loud. It was not public in the way others were, but it was real. They spoke to one another. They encouraged one another. They remained aligned even when everything around them suggested otherwise. And this quiet faithfulness becomes one of the most significant elements of the story, because it reveals that truth does not disappear simply because it is ignored. That faithfulness does not lose its value simply because it is not recognized. That alignment with God is not dependent on external validation. And then something remarkable is revealed. Something that shifts the perspective entirely. Because it is said that God listens, that He hears, that He pays attention not only to the loud voices of complaint, but to the quiet voices of reverence. And this changes everything. Because it means that nothing has gone unnoticed, nothing has been lost, nothing has been overlooked. And the imagery that follows is deeply personal, that a book of remembrance is written, a record not of achievements, not of status, but of those who feared the Lord and honored His name. And this idea introduces a level of intimacy that contrasts sharply with the distance the people felt. Because while they questioned whether God saw, whether He cared, whether He was present, this reveals that He was not only present, He was attentive, engaged, recording, remembering. And this remembrance is not passive. It carries purpose. It points forward to something that has not yet happened but is certain to come. The distinction that has been forming quietly is now declared openly, because there will come a day when the difference between the righteous and the wicked will be unmistakable, not blurred, not hidden, not subject to interpretation, but clear, visible, undeniable. And this statement directly answers the question that had been raised earlier, the question of justice, the question of whether there is truly a difference between those who serve God and those who do not. And the answer is yes, but that difference is not always visible immediately. It is not always apparent in the present. It is revealed fully in the future, when everything is brought into alignment with truth, and this introduces a tension that runs through the entire message. The tension between what is seen now and what will be revealed later, between temporary appearance and ultimate reality. And understanding this tension is essential, because it determines how one lives in the present, whether based on immediate observation or on future certainty. The language then shifts toward that future moment, and it is described not as distant possibility, but as approaching reality, a day that is coming, burning like a furnace, a day that will not treat everything the same, a day that will expose, consume, refine, and reveal. And this is where the weight of the message reaches a new level. Because this is not merely correction, it is finality. It is the culmination of everything that has been building, everything that has been ignored, everything that has been justified. And the imagery is intense, because for those who have rejected, who have resisted, who have chosen to remain in their own understanding, that day is not relief, it is destruction, like stubble consumed by fire, leaving nothing behind, no root, no branch, no continuation. And this is not described lightly. It is not softened. It is presented as the reality of what happens when truth is continually rejected, when opportunity is ignored, when the invitation to return is refused. But in contrast, for those who fear the Lord, for those whose names are written in remembrance, that same day is not destruction. It is transformation. It is healing. It is restoration. And the imagery shifts again, from fire that consumes to light that heals, described as the sun of righteousness rising with healing in its wings. And this contrast is powerful, because it shows that the same event produces entirely different outcomes depending on where one stands, depending on how one has responded, depending on whether one has aligned with truth or resisted it. And this reinforces the idea that the present moment matters, that the decisions made now are not isolated. They are connected to what is coming. They determine how that future will be experienced. And then the message returns once more to the present, not to repeat what has already been said, but to anchor everything in something that has always been available, something that has always been clear. The law given through Moses, the commands, the statutes, the foundation that defined what it meant to live in alignment with God. And this return is significant, because it shows that the people are not lacking direction. They are not without guidance. They have what they need. They have always had it. The issue is not absence, it is response, not lack of truth, but lack of alignment with it. And this reinforces the central tension of the entire message, that the problem is not external, it is internal. It is not that God has been silent, it is that his voice has not been followed. And as this part of the message closes, the contrast remains clear, defined, unavoidable, between those who continue in their own way and those who return, between those who question and those who trust, between those who are remembered and those who are consumed. And the weight of that contrast does not diminish, it increases, because the time to respond is narrowing. The voice that is spoken so clearly is approaching its final moment, and what remains now is not more explanation, not more clarification, but the reality that everything has been revealed. Everything has been placed before them, and the decision that follows will determine everything that comes next, not only for them, but for how they will experience the silence that is about to begin. The message has reached its sharpest edge, where judgment and promise stand side by side, where destruction and healing are both certain, where the future is no longer a question of if, but when, and yet just when everything seems to be closing in, just when the weight of what is coming feels almost unbearable, something unexpected appears, something that shifts the tone without removing the tension, something that introduces not escape, but hope. And it comes in the form of a promise that feels both familiar and mysterious at the same time. because the voice of Malachi does not end with fire, it does not end with separation. It moves toward restoration, but not in the way the people might expect, not through immediate change, not through visible transformation, but through the announcement of someone who has not yet arrived, someone who will come before that great and terrible day, someone whose role is not to judge, but to prepare. The name that is spoken carries weight, not because of the individual alone, but because of what that name represents. Elijah the prophet, who once stood against kings, who once called fire from heaven, who once confronted a nation drifting into idolatry, and now that name returns, not as a repetition of history, but as a sign of something about to happen again, not the same event, but the same kind of interruption, the same kind of voice that breaks through complacency, that calls people back, that confronts what has been allowed to remain. And this promise is not random, it is precise, because it addresses the very problem that has been revealed throughout the message. The breakdown of relationship, the loss of alignment, the distance between what should be connected. And the role of this coming messenger is described in a way that reaches deeper than behavior, deeper than ritual, into the core of human connection itself. He will turn the hearts of fathers to their children, and the hearts of children to their fathers. And that statement, though it may seem simple at first, carries profound meaning, because it speaks to restoration at the most foundational level, not just between people and God, but between people themselves. Because when alignment with God is lost, it does not remain isolated. It affects every relationship, every connection, every structure that depends on trust, on faithfulness, on commitment. And this is exactly what has been seen: broken marriages, fractured trust, misplaced priorities, a society where covenant has been replaced by convenience. And now the promise is that before the final day arrives, before everything is brought into full clarity, there will be a moment of opportunity, a chance for restoration, a call to return not only to God, but to one another, a reordering of what has been disordered, a healing of what has been broken. But even within this promise, there is tension, because it is not guaranteed that everyone will respond. It is not certain that every heart will turn, and this is where the warning remains. Because if that restoration does not take place, if the call is ignored, if the opportunity is missed, then what follows is not simply continuation, it is consequence. It is the land struck with a curse, not as arbitrary punishment, but as the natural result of continued separation, continued misalignment, continued refusal to return. And this dual outcome runs through everything that has been said. That the same moment can lead to restoration or destruction, depending on how it is received, depending on how it is answered. And this is what makes the promise so powerful, because it exists in the space between what is and what is coming. It is the final bridge before the silence, the last indication that God is still reaching, still calling, still providing a way back, and yet it also signals that something is about to change. Because after this, there will be no more prophets, no more direct messages in the same way, no more voices breaking into the present with new words. And that reality gives everything that has been said an even greater weight, because it means that this message, this moment, this invitation, is not one of many. It is the last before a long period where the voice that once spoke so consistently will no longer be heard. The idea of silence begins to form here, not fully realized yet, but present in the distance, like something approaching that cannot be stopped. And that makes this promise even more significant, because it becomes the final point of hope before that silence begins. The last indication that what has been broken can still be restored, that what has been lost can still be found, that what has been drifting can still return. And yet the silence itself is not meaningless. It is not absence without purpose. It is a space, a waiting, a tension that holds what has been promised without yet revealing its full fulfillment. And as the words of the prophet come closer to their end, the weight of everything that has been said begins to settle into a single realization, that this is not just about correction, not just about warning, not just about judgment. It is about preparation, about setting the stage for something greater than the people can currently see, something that will not arrive immediately, something that will take time, centuries even, before it is fully revealed. And yet when it comes, it will answer every question that has been raised. It will resolve every tension that has been introduced. It will fulfill every promise that has been spoken. But for now, for the people standing in that moment, for those hearing these words for the first time, none of that is visible yet. All they have is the message, the warning, the promise, and the approaching silence. And the question that remains is the same one that has been present from the beginning: whether they will respond, whether they will return, whether they will allow their hearts to be turned. Because once the silence begins, the opportunity to hear this voice in this way will be gone, and what remains will not be new words, but the memory of what has already been said, the echo of a final message that will carry them through a time when the voice is no longer heard, but still needed more than ever. And then, without ceremony, without transition, without any dramatic signal that it is about to happen, the voice simply stops. The words that had carried through generations, that had corrected, warned, guided, and called the people back again and again, come to an end. Not because there is nothing left to say, but because everything that needed to be said has already been spoken, and the final echoes of Malachi do not fade into another message. They fade into something far heavier, far more difficult to endure. Silence, not the silence of peace, not the silence of rest, but the silence of waiting, the silence of absence, the silence that forces people to live with what they have already heard without receiving anything new. And at first, it is almost unnoticeable, because life continues, the temple still stands, the sacrifices still take place, the routines of worship are still performed. And on the surface, nothing appears to have changed, but something has, something profound, something that cannot be seen but can be felt, because the voice that once interrupted, that once confronted, that once corrected, is no longer there. The people who had grown accustomed to hearing from God, whether they responded or resisted, now find themselves in a different reality. One where the questions they had once asked no longer receive immediate answers, where the doubts they had once voiced are no longer directly addressed, where the warnings that once came to redirect them are no longer spoken in the same way. And this absence begins to create a tension that grows over time, because without the voice, everything becomes heavier. Decisions become more uncertain. Understanding becomes more dependent on memory rather than fresh revelation. And this is where the true weight of what has just happened begins to settle in. Because the silence is not empty, it is filled with everything that has already been said, every warning, every promise, every call to return, now standing without reinforcement, without repetition, without new clarification. Generations begin to pass within this silence. Children are born who have never heard a prophet speak, who have only been told of what once was, of a time when God spoke directly, when his words were clear, when his presence was unmistakable, and for them that reality begins to feel distant, almost like a story rather than an experience, something to be believed, but not something they have personally encountered. And this creates a new kind of challenge, because faith that is inherited must now become faith that is chosen. Belief that was once supported by direct voice must now stand on what has already been revealed. And this transition is not easy, because the absence of new words can feel like absence altogether, even when it is not. And yet, within this silence, something else is happening. Something that is not immediately visible, something that is unfolding beneath the surface of history, because while the voice has stopped, the promise has not. While the words have ceased, the plan continues. And the tension between what has been promised and what has not yet been fulfilled begins to grow, creating a space where expectation builds, where anticipation forms, where the question is no longer whether God will act, but when and how. And this is what defines this period, not simply silence, but waiting, not absence, but preparation. Because the last message did not end without direction. It pointed forward, it spoke of a messenger, of a turning of hearts, of a day that is coming. And those who remember, those who hold on to those words, begin to live with a different perspective, not defined by what they do not hear, but by what they know has been promised. But not everyone holds on to that. Not everyone remains anchored in what was said. Because silence can have different effects depending on how it is understood. For some, it deepens faith, it strengthens trust, it refines belief into something more personal, more resilient, less dependent on immediate confirmation. But for others, it creates doubt, distance, a gradual fading of conviction. Because without reinforcement, without reminder, Without the constant presence of a voice, it becomes easier to drift, easier to question, easier to redefine what was once clear, and this is where the silence becomes a test, not of knowledge, but of alignment, not of information, but of faithfulness. And as time continues, as years turn into decades, and decades into centuries, the silence itself becomes part of the story, a defining characteristic of the period, something that shapes how people think, how they live, how they understand their relationship with God. And yet even in that, the tension never fully disappears, because the last words spoken still remain, still echo, that still carry weight, the promise of a messenger, the certainty of a coming day, the assurance that what is hidden will be revealed, that what is broken will be addressed, that what is true will ultimately stand. And these words, though no longer spoken, do not lose their power. They become the foundation upon which everything else must stand. And so the silence is not an end, it is a pause, not a conclusion, but a space between what has been declared and what will be fulfilled, a space that stretches far longer than anyone in that moment could have imagined, a space that would last for generations, for centuries, a space that would test, refine, reveal, and prepare, until the moment arrives when the silence is broken, not by another prophet speaking in the same way as before, but by something greater, something that will not only speak, but embody the message itself. But that moment has not yet come, and for now, the story remains here, in the silence, in the waiting, in the tension between what has been said and what has not yet been seen. And this is where everything slows, where the noise fades, where the absence becomes undeniable, and the question that lingers is not whether God has spoken, because he has, but whether what he has already said is enough to sustain those who must now live without hearing his voice again for a very long time. The silence was never meant to be comfortable, it was never meant to be easy, it was meant to reveal something, to expose what remains when the voice is no longer heard, when the guidance is no longer immediate, when the presence that once spoke directly is no longer experienced in the same way. And as the centuries unfolded, as generation after generation lived within that silence, the question that began in the days of Malachi did not disappear, it only grew louder within the hearts of those who remembered, those who held on to the final words that had been spoken, because those words were not just a conclusion, they were a promise, a direction, a marker pointing forward to something that had not yet come. And the tension between what had been said and what had not yet been seen became the defining reality of that entire period. Some adapted to the silence by forgetting, by allowing the absence of a voice to reshape their expectations, to lower their sense of urgency, to redefine their understanding of what it meant to follow God. And over time, what had once been clear began to blur. What had once been strong began to weaken, because without constant reminder, without the interruption of a prophetic voice, it became easier to drift, easier to replace conviction with routine, easier to maintain the form while losing the substance. And this pattern, though quieter than open rebellion, carried the same danger, because it created a version of faith that looked intact but was slowly losing its foundation. But others responded differently, not by ignoring the silence, but by leaning into it, by holding tightly to what had already been spoken, by refusing to let the absence of new words erase the truth of the old ones. And for them, the silence did not become a void. It became a space of expectation, a place where faith was no longer sustained by hearing, but by remembering, by trusting, by choosing to believe that what had been promised would still come to pass, even when there was no immediate evidence to support it. And this distinction between forgetting and remembering, between drifting and holding on, became the dividing line that ran quietly through those centuries, shaping lives in ways that were not always visible, but were deeply real. And as time continued, the weight of that final promise began to grow, not diminish, because the longer it remained unfulfilled, the more it demanded an answer, the more it created anticipation, the more it raised a question that could not be permanently ignored. When will it happen? When will the messenger come? When will the silence be broken? When will justice be revealed? When will the turning of hearts take place? And this question, though not always spoken aloud, existed beneath the surface, carried forward through generations, preserved in the memory of those who refused to let it go. Because the silence was not empty, it was filled with expectation, It was filled with tension. It was filled with the weight of something that had been promised but not yet delivered. And that tension was not accidental, it was necessary, because it prepared the way for something greater than what had come before. Something that would not only speak truth, but embody it. Something that would not only call people back, but create a way for them to truly return. And when that moment finally came, when the silence was broken, it would not feel like a continuation. It would feel like an arrival, like the answer to every question that had been building, like the fulfillment of everything that had been left unresolved. But before that moment arrives, the story pauses here, intentionally, deliberately, in the silence itself, because the silence is part of the message. It forces a reflection that words alone cannot create. It demands a response that is not based on immediate instruction, but on internal conviction. And this is where the story turns from history into something personal. Because the conditions that existed then are not limited to that time. They exist wherever people find themselves without clarity, without immediate answers, without a clear voice directing every step. And the question that remains is the same. What do you do in the silence? How do you respond when you are not being told what to do next? When the voice is not as clear, when the direction is not as obvious? Do you drift, slowly, quietly, almost without noticing? Adjusting your understanding to fit your circumstances, lowering your expectations, redefining what is right based on what feels manageable? Or do you hold on, not to something new, but to what has already been revealed, choosing to trust even when you cannot see, choosing to remain aligned even when it is not reinforced, choosing to believe that silence is not absence, but preparation, not rejection, but waiting, because that is what this story ultimately reveals. Not just the final words of a prophet, but the space that follows those words. The space where everything must be decided without hearing anything new. The space where faith is no longer supported by constant confirmation, but must stand on its own. And that space is not comfortable. It is not easy, but it is necessary, because it reveals what is real, what remains when everything else is removed. And that is where the story ends. Not with a voice, but with silence. Not with an answer, but with a question. Not with resolution, but with tension.